Human beings live in the world of interesting contradictions. They cohabit the space with other human beings, but also flora and fauna. We also rely on each other for survival. And depending on what side of the curve you belong to, you're also harassing, oppressing, and eventually trying to eliminate the other from your sight. If you are part of a safari, of a jungle, probably then you are a weakest human link if there is a wild animal staring at you. However, if you are in a metro cities or urban spaces with your own technological advances, maybe you are a threat to the rest. And same goes with nature that cohabits us. If it goes out of control, then we face the wrath through its cyclonic as well as earthquakes that the humans are unable to control. Growing up as a child, we have been always curious people. We might have asked our parents one in our life, why are things the way they are? When we stare up into the sky, the blue blanket must have inspired us. Then the running moon through the clouds must have also created a curiosity in our mind. Then when we looked into the soil, the ground, the mushiness, and then when we went to the sea, we marveled at the waves. We were so curious as child that we didn't stop asking questions. We looked at the sun sinking into the sea, but also we were awake to see the sun rise early in the morning. Each of its ambience, the silhouette it created much of interesting questions in our mind. And so when we asked our parents, why are certain people the way they are? Mother, why is there a beggar on the street? Mom, why the maid cannot send her child to the same school that I go? Mom, why is the driver uncle? Or why is our servant unable to do the same things that we are able to? Our parents must have given interesting responses depending on what side of the curve they belong to. Many a times, unable to answer the contradictions of society that we currently inhabit, they might have just shut us down by saying, this is the way how things have been. But that might have left us a huge void, a gap in our mind as to why things exist. And you must have gone onto your own journey of finding out what exactly is happening. Did our parents tell us about a structure that is existing to harass and eventually control us? It is the system of oppression. Oppression is across the world. It has different names, it has different shapes, it has different sizes, and of course, it has evolved into a new lingua. You and me, when we have a conversation as human beings, we predicate on the principles of mutualities, which are respect, dignity, justice, and equality. These are uncompromising principles and unwritten laws that we have established between us human beings. But what happens when there is no equality, when there is no space for justice, when there is no occasion to establish a dignity and there is no norm to recognize the respectability of the other person? That is a system that is culturally rooted and historically inspired. That is oppression. Oppression is something very personal, very local, as well as it is impersonal and international in its scope. Depending on what side of the prism you are looking at and looking through, you will be able to recognize the notions, the norms, as well as the designations of oppression. You might be a person belonging into a society where you are oppressed by your own status, by your own class, by your own gender, by your own sexuality, by your own preferences of religion, and so forth. However, your identity as an oppressed person might not really reflect in another society where you might be in a majority. So essentially, the paradox of oppression exists within a political democratic framework of majoritarian versus minoritarian. However, majoritarian not necessarily as a majority of a group of people, but majority as a culture, majority as a hegemonic enterprise, and minority as a space of non-existence. For example, if you are a Muslim in a country that is majority non-Muslim, you are a minority and you might be an oppressed subject in that space. However, if you are a country dominated predominantly Muslim, then the non-Muslim population could be the subject of oppression. Oppression has various ways to find into our own curriculum, into our own attitudes, and into our own personal relationship. Oftentimes, it transcends into our own houses where oppression just becomes a language for us to establish a certain supremacy. Now, if we think about oppressions and the oppressed subjects, what does it take? What does it make, and why would it do the oppression to survive? What does it take? It takes two subjects and two objects, always interrelating with each other. There has to be one who is an oppressor, and there has to be two who is an oppressed. But then, for oppression and for the oppressed to have a conversation with each other, there has to be a system where oppressor establishes the rules and the oppressed has to follow. If oppressed refuses to follow, then starts the question of pounding on much more layered oppression. For example, we are living in a country where a person is belonging to a dominant, let's say, color caste or the race. If you are a black person in America, you are the lowest in the chain of human existence. Be it education, be it health sector, be it sector of education, and as well as the field of where you go to schools, from primary, from higher education to the status of you getting job, you are still oppressed because the system of oppression is predicated on exclusion. Oppression requires a mandate of exclusion and violence. African American people in America remain oppressed irrespective of their status in the society, irrespective of them being billionaires or also them being, for example, lying on the streets as homeless people. You, for example, go to Africa and then there exists a continent of black people, yet oppression exists. Let me take you to Nigeria, for example, in Igbo land. There are a group of people called Ohu and Osu. Education rate amongst these people, like African American, be it primary or higher education, or the experience of this is almost complementary. Yet, this group was sinned. This group was considered impure, and they were banished from the quotidian mainstream society. The Ohu and Osu were oppressed by the Dialas. Over several centuries, they grouped together, the outcast Ohu and Osu, and formed an interpersonal economy of each other. They supported each other and became relatively economically prosperous. Yet, because of their economic status, they could get education and job. Still, in an oppressive society, they are considered lowborn. Because of their lowborn status, they cannot marry into other caste groups which are non-Ohu, non-Osu, and that invites oppression. Similar forms of oppression can be seen across the board. Oppressed people are known by various names. In Mauritania, they might be known as Haratin. In Mali, they might be known as Bela. In Kenya, they might be known as Wata. In Senegal, they might be known as Neno. In Europe, they might be known as Roma and Sinti. In France, they might be known as Kago. In India, they might be known as Dalits or tribals or Adivasis. In Australia, they might be known as the indigenous people. In New Zealand, they might be known as Maori. In Canada, they might be known as First Nations. In across the world, wherever you go, be it Japan, where they might be known as Burakumin, there are subjects who are oppressed. Oppression exists within the framework of governmentality. Government, the state, recognizes certain forms of oppressions and discards certain forms. In 2001, the World Conference Against Racism hosted a conversation on related forms of xenophobia and discriminations, which were very much similar to racism in Durban. A newly country, South Africa, hosted world people, governments, as well as non government bodies to contest and appeal for the human rights of their people. Oppression requires state support. The governments recognized certain forms of oppression, be it color, be it race, and be it other forms of discriminations that were recognized in the global context. However, majority of the oppressions, especially the one coming from the notions of caste, the derogatory forms of discrimination based on descent were discarded. Here, what we see is oppression is recognized, yet it is not recognized. Government chooses what forms of oppression to notice and what form of oppression to reject. Now, the government doesn't recognize immediately or had not just woke up out of a sleep to realize that race was a problem. It took sacrifices of several generations and so many petitions and bloods that has been shed on the streets that gave rise to the recognition of color-based black oppression in the world. Similarly, the people who are oppressed by their sexuality, by their lobbying and persistent effort, although undergoing the humiliations and indignities, have now recognized a space where state acknowledges the existence of sexual minorities and also creates provisions for their protection and welfare. Similarly, there are many forms of group across the world that I have just mentioned who have not been had registers of notice. They have been buried under the broader hegemonic identities of oppression the way the state wants us to. That's why today we do not have a space for caste-based oppression that harasses close to 820 million people across the world, of them 300 million former untouchables and 200 million of them considered as indigenous and nomadic tribes in Indian context itself. Let me tell you how oppression is impersonal as well as it becomes public. There is very little gap. If I am insecure about a space, if I'm insecure about the person, I will utilize the resources at my disposal to harass other person so the person doesn't get recognized and doesn't receive the dignity they deserve. I utilize the canons of prejudice, stereotype, and as well as historical notions of putting down other person. It doesn't take much for me to oppress person. Oppression is as simple as calling someone's name. And oppression can be channeled without much state or structural support. You can still be oppressive. However, when we want to enact oppression on a scalar much bigger than a personal level, we require support of a structure that is supported by a policies of capitalism, and as well as structures of historical discriminations depending on the societies you come from, let's call in this case caste. In Hathras, in India, September 2020, a young woman and a mother who are landless laborers go into the field to do their job. The mother waits for her daughter because she loses her sight. After some time, she noticed that the daughter is not around. 19-year-old daughter is not in her sight. She goes looking for her. She calls her name. There's no response. Then some kids come and tell her that they found her daughter lying on the street. This daughter is barely breathing. She is fighting to her life. Mother sees her daughter in such a disgusting space. She tries to cover her private part and tries to call out for help. The mother and family take the daughter to hospital. The police registers a case, and then there is a refusal to acknowledge that there was a case of sexual assault and rape. 4 men rape this Dalit woman of 19-year-old. After fighting for her life, 2 weeks later, this 19-year-old Dalit woman dies. After her death, the parents are not allowed to see her daughter. The post-mortem report is not allowed. The exhumation of that body is not allowed. Autopsy, the report of that is not disclosed. This is the ritual within the Hinduism where one doesn't burn the pyre in the night. Avoiding any form of laws, codes, and moralities within religious codes. The body of the 19-year-old landless laborer Dalit woman was burnt without their parents. This oppression starts with a personal vendetta to becoming a impersonal public appeal where after this incident, irrespective of whatever caste one belongs to or group one belongs to, the humanity should descend to unite about for such kind of existence, such kind of oppressions existing amidst us. Yet the people from the dominant caste who are accused of rape form a council to protest against arrest of their four men. What we see is oppression can exist on each level. But what it takes is an entire mass of group to validate that. And if it gets validated, it becomes law. Today, much of the fight against oppression is predicated on historical mischievous acts, which are legitimized and eventually finding its space into legislations as something normal. People fighting against oppression across the world are fighting against poverty, are fighting for dignity, are fighting for justice, are fighting for equality, are fighting for opportunity, and are fighting for fair existence. The forces who do not want to give all of this to other are the oppressors. And that is why oppression, though exists locally in different contexts, it is connected globally because it is a concern of human with other human.